So thank you so much for joining us this afternoon for the webinar series that's been provided by the American School Health Association. Today's webinar is about writing for publications, a review of key elements to include and common errors. And so just a little bit about the American School Health Association. The mission of ASHA is to transform all schools into places where every student learns and thrives. ASHA envisions healthy students who learn and achieve in safe and healthy environments, nurtured by caring adults, functioning within coordinated school and community support systems. If you are not a member yet and would like to be, here are some membership benefits when you join ASHA. You'd have access to the peer-reviewed journal of the Journal of School Health. You'd also have access to the latest school health through an annual conference, bi-weekly newsletter, and networking communities, opportunities to receive continuing education credits through the different webinars and conferences that are provided by ASHA. Discounted rates for posting of jobs that you might have at your organization in their career center, and a discount to all AAP publications. So again, if you're not a member, there are some great benefits to consider if you would like to become a member. Also, just to make a save the date, please be aware that the next ASHA conference is right around the corner. It's going to be October 2nd through 4th. In Cincinnati. If you go to the ASHA website, registration is already open, so please put this on your calendar for a save the date and consider joining us in Cincinnati this year. For our webinar today, our presenter is Bethany A. Bell. She is an associate professor in the College of Social Work and the University of South Carolina. Her academic training is in community and family health and educational research, measurement, and statistics. Her applied research focuses on social determinants of health, and her methodological research aims to expand the knowledge base of complex statistical procedures so they can be used by applied researchers to conduct more robust analysis. She has over 90 publications and serves on multiple editorial boards, including the Journal of School Health and the Journal of School Psychology. And with that, I will turn it over to Bethany.
Great, thank you. Let me share my screen. Slideshow. Oh, I messed that one up big time, didn't I? All right. Sorry, I thought I had it all ready, and now it's, you guys are not, there it is. Okay, thank you for the great introduction. And thank you for everyone who's attending today. The brief outline is, I'm going to just do a very brief introduction, focus on some of the critiques that are often people who review a lot of manuscripts. These are things we see time and time and time again. So really the what not to do, and then we'll move into, well, what are the ways you can write publishable papers? And that's most of that is reflective of what not to do, but it also, at the end of the presentation, I have some resources, and the first resource listed is a paper I published in about 2010, I believe, talking about dissemination of research, and so a lot of this came from that. So you also have a more detailed example for those that want to follow up. And then common QUAL methods and common statistical procedures. And then a little bit about deciding on where to submit your manuscript, resources, and questions. So the biggest thing that I can't stress enough is before you publish your research, you have to do your research. And it's at that phase that's going to have a huge impact on the publishability of your research. And so I don't know if anyone's ever heard the statement, garbage in equals garbage out. But if a research study is not well designed from the beginning, it's much harder to ever publish that, because reviewers are going to be concerned about all the limitations. Some limitations are acceptable, but if it's really just not a well-designed study, it's going to be very hard to get that published. So to help ensure that you have a solid research design from step one, you really need to make sure that you have sound methodologists on the research team, whether it's a qualitative methodologist, a quantitative methodologist, a mixed methods methodologist, just somebody whose job is really to envision and critique everything about the research design from the from the design time. So then once you have quality data, when it comes to publishing your findings, there's really two overarching things to remember. The first was personally shared from the editor of the Journal of School Health, Bob McDermott, and follow author guidelines. And he reminded me that 80% of publishing is following the rules, and I completely agree with that. It's, you know, if it doesn't even, nothing is in the right format, the type of study isn't something that the journal publishes, it's a waste of everybody's time. So do your research on the details for the journal you're submitting to. And then most of what the rest of this presentation is about, almost everything goes back to this notion of transparency and replicability. These are two concepts that you should always keep in mind when you're writing for publication, because those are the two pillars of the scientific inquiry, is transparency and replicability. And I say scientific inquiry and people will automatically think quantitative, and that is technically correct, but even a qualitative study should be detailed enough that someone could replicate it. So what are the things to avoid in your manuscripts? The very first section of your manuscript is the introduction or the background, and you need to be able to compel why your study is important. So what we often see as reviewers is a lack of description of the gap in the literature. So authors are not situating the importance of their study within the broader field of whatever the study is about. In our example, school health. And or omissions of seminal pieces. You don't have to do an exhaustive lit review, but there are certain pieces that if reviewers are going to be looking for, if it's school mental health, if it's nutrition, physical activity, all of those things, the editors are going to send those papers out to the known experts in that area. And if you've omitted a seminal piece, it raises question about your real knowledge of the literature. And then for myself, being a methodologist as well, this is in purple, the only one in purple, because this is the biggest issue. If the methods lack adequate description, then it's not, then my most common comment to an author is not transparent, not replicable. And then I list all the areas that need improvement. So I cannot beat that like into brains enough. That really is somebody should be able to pick up your study, read your methods, and be able to ideally replicate it within reason. Another common thing that we see is an inappropriate study design, or sometimes when the methods employed don't align with the research question. So for example, if authors state a research question about assessing the relationship between two variables, that would assume a correlational study, or at very minimum a quantitative study, but yet they approach that research question through phenomenology. That's a disconnect. Or strictly within the qualitative world, if a research question focuses on behaviors, but the researchers conducted interviews, where in the qualitative world, there's literature, behaviors are best assessed through observation, and so those two would be a disconnect. Another area of disconnect is using advanced statistical methods when you really doesn't do anything better. So sometimes I feel authors now feel the pressure to use fancy, quote unquote, fancy statistical methods when simple linear regression would do just fine. Like there's nothing, for example, someone using structural equation modeling, but everything that they've measured really is an observed variable and it doesn't really gain benefit through the structural equation modeling. And so I remember my professors always telling me to keep it simple, and you always want to aim for the most parsimonious analytic plan that addresses your full research question. Insufficient sample. In a quant study, an example would be either a small sample size or poor methods to create the sample. So people wanting to present their research and it's based off of a pure convenience sample, and also more importantly, no acknowledgement that it's based off of a convenience sample. And so from a QUAL perspective, what we would view as an insufficient sample is something where the study lacked iterative sampling, and the authors did not report iterative sampling, and they did not report anything about achieving saturation. For QUAL studies, also a lack of analytic depth. When authors just present findings, like using a lot of quotes, pretty surface, it makes it appear that there's not a thorough analysis of the data. And then unnecessary statistical procedures. This is another common thing that I report on. Authors have the tendency to report a ton of statistical analyses that are not needed to answer the 2 or 3 research questions. For example, I recently reviewed a manuscript. If you put this in perspective, the actual manuscript was 30 pages and it had 50 pages of supplemental analyses and appendices. It was mind-boggling. I just gave up trying to read all of those appendices. And then, of course, they didn't adjust their alpha levels at all. So, I mean, type 1 error rate is just happened at some point in all those models. So really thinking about what analysis do I need to do to answer my research question. And if you do supplemental analysis, really have a strong justification for why you did that. For data quality, so sometimes we're just concerned with the overall data quality. So in quant studies, that's really, again, back to that sampling or concerns about the generalizability of the sample. For quant studies, sorry. For QUAL, one of the data quality concerns is if it seems that the researchers impose their views on the data, or often we're concerned about the quality of the data if the researchers do not report any data verifying techniques. So they don't report anything about triangulation, member checking, examining rival explanations. They just state their findings and leave it at that, because those are critical pieces of ensuring the quality of the research for QUAL research. A huge another one is writing a directional hypothesis, but using a non-directional statistical test. I'm actually conducting a study with some students right now where we're reviewing articles published in social work journals where this is occurring. You can have directional hypotheses, but if you do, you've got to make an adjustment to your analysis to account for those directional hypotheses. And then specific to QUAL studies, no information on the background, training, or preconceptions of the researchers who completed the study. So again, especially for qualitative research, you really have to explain your qualifications to be doing this study and how you've checked your preconceptions. A little bit more back to authors don't know the literature or understand how to make a key contribution. This was an odd one. I wasn't sure where I wanted to place it. But it summarizes basically there's 2 ways to advance a field. You either apply new methods to old questions, or you come up with new questions to answer. And let me say, these are overarching. There's more nuance. But when you're advancing the field by examining new questions, it's probably okay for there to be limitations with the sample, such maybe you did a pilot study because you're developing a new tool and your sample size is relatively small. That's not a problem because you're trying to advance the field. But it's not okay to have a really small sample size when you're answering a question that's been answered plenty of other times. So you have to balance how are you contributing to the literature. And then specifically when you're publishing in the Journal of School Health, there's a requirement as stated in the author guidelines that you have to have a substantive and clear discussion regarding the practical implications of your findings for school health. And this is often an overlooked section. And that would be a reason that it would either be, definitely would be revised and resubmit. And if you, in that process, your study really doesn't have a direct implication, then that's really not the place where you would want to be publishing your work. Okay, no questions, I guess? Okay, good. If I'm talking too fast, please let me know. So what are some key elements of publishable manuscripts? So this set of slides are the ones that are somewhat, I highly borrowed from my own paper that is listed at the end that you can all read in more detail or print and keep by your computer. So the first is having a concise abstract. Basically, abstracts should allow the reader to determine whether they should retrieve articles for closer review. And so you should strive to write abstracts that are accurate, non-evaluative, coherent, readable, and concise. So how do you do that? These are the elements. So depending on the journal, whether it's structured or unstructured, each journal is going to differ. But regardless of the structure of the abstract, you should always have the purpose of the research, the sample, the primary methods, basic findings of the study, and brief statements about conclusions or implications. So after you've done that, you really need to write a compelling introduction. You really need to, that's going to determine for the reader whether they want to continue reading your article. And so you really need to, from the get-go, situate your questions and it within the literature and enhance the utility of studies for both interested researchers and practitioners. You've got to basically sell your study. So you have to explain clearly why you did the study. And again, you don't have to write exhaustive literature reviews, but you should be citing key pieces. But really the key here is you've got to sell, you've got to get your audience, so your readers or your reviewers, excited to read through the rest of your paper. And so I like to say that the appropriate research methods are necessary but not sufficient. So that's where the next, many seasoned researchers may respond with the proverbial "so what?" if they're unconvinced by your reasoning and the importance. And I have to admit that I've given that comment a lot of times. The other comment I tend to give if there's too many statistical procedures is that the results were dizzying. So those are two things you kind of want to avoid having, and we're going to talk about how you can avoid that. So you develop clear descriptions of meaningful problems and explain how you're filling in that gap in the literature. And then make sure that your research questions or your hypotheses or your purpose statement ends. So your literature section, your background should end with a very clear statement about what your study is doing and what it's adding. So we have many slides that are about the method section. And so, because again, if the goal is transparency and replicability, that's all in the method section. I mean, that's the crux of the study, right? And then the results. So an overall goal for the method section is where we should be able to know who was included and excluded from participation, what measures were used, how and where data were collected, and which analytic and statistical procedures were used. And by carefully delineating these details allows the reader to judge the scientific merit of your study. And so basically the method section is where the goals of transparency and replicability are absolutely key. So what does the method section contain? So the first part of the method should be a subsection on your participants. So as much detail as possible, but definitely characteristics about the people and characteristics that are related to your research questions, and also inclusion and exclusion criteria. So I like to suggest, can you ask yourself, could someone replicate the study based on what I just wrote? If the answer is no, add more details. Sampling procedures also need to be explicitly disclosed, and so you need to include the specific strategies, what stratified sample, purposeful sample, and you also need to include the participation rates and the response rates, and if able, the prevalence of self-selection. And then this is really important because the sampling procedures can be influenced by the contextual conditions. So you also need to put how were subjects contacted and or selected, and you need to clearly discuss any weird circumstances around data collection, and also if any information was given to the participants before actually starting the study. So how much did you disclose? So if you're doing like an intervention, you can't disclose as much as if you're just doing a non-intervention study where you're just wanting to collect data. Provide clear explanations for your sample size. Ideally, if this was a quantitative study, you need to report information on a priori power analysis. Hopefully it was done. If it wasn't done, then why it was not done, and if it was done, how was it done, what parameters did you use, and if it was not conducted, you need to be cognizant and prepared to discuss that as an underpowered being an implication of your results. This is also where you would want to report rates of attrition or non-participation. And for your sampling for a qualitative sampling study, this is where you could be reporting the iterative process and how you got to your number. If you're using data saturation approaches, you could possibly say, we aimed for 15, we didn't reach saturation, so we recruited 10 more, or what have you, but that sort of detail. This is also where you can put information on your IRB and any community agency approval that affected participants' enrollment. More incentives used, were safety measures employed. And so I know it seems a little daunting to have all these strict reporting guidelines, but being this detailed and specific is going to increase your chances of being published. And if that's the goal, right? That's our goal, is for publication. And so we have to be transparent in everything that our study did. So another section is where I say well-specified measures. That definitely leans more quant, but you could work on QUAL as well here, because you could include your interview guides or other tools that you use, your observation sheets, any tools that you use to gather your data. And so basically this section should be your roadmap for everything that was employed to collect your data, okay? And this also specifically with QUAL is you need to state and provide reasons why your specific data collection method was used, because with qualitative research, there's a lot more choice in methods used depending on the type of qualitative study you engage in. We have a few slides at the end about that. And so if you chose one data collection method over another, you need to state why that was your preferred method and why you believe it was the better method. Back to quant, when you're describing your measures, they should include, you should operationalize how your variables were measured. If you're using instruments such as assessments, direct observation, survey questionnaires, all of that, you need to name them if they're existing if they're existing instruments. If they're study developed instruments, you need to talk about that. And then if you were doing an experimental design, you need to have the details and sequence of those manipulations. So basically you can think of this as, I need to report the how, when, and by whom in relation to all the measures that were administered in your study. Sticking in this topic, when using previously known standardized measures, you need to report two types of information. You need to report information about the existing psychometrics of the measure. So that would usually come from the user's guide. And then you also need to report your reliability and, if you can, validity for your specific sample, okay? So there's two things. Oftentimes as a reviewer, I see people do the first bullet, but then they don't report any reliability or psychometrics on their sample. And that is actually the second bullet is of more concern and must be reported. Ideally, both are. And so if you develop any measures, you really need, that adds a whole lot to this section because you've got to detail how those measures were developed, the reliability and validation procedures. You have to evaluate, basically, if you don't do this, then as a reviewer or a reader, if it were to be published, we don't know anything about the quality or the soundness of the measure. And so going back to that garbage in equals garbage out, if we don't know that it's a valid or reliable measure, then the meaning of all of your results could be tainted. This also, if you're collecting data, you would need to detail how the data training was, how the collection process was done, including training and retraining. So what measures required training, who was trained, how were the researchers trained? Most importantly, how is the training determined to be successful? And so we often will, I'm kind of interweaving the bads and the good. So by doing this, you eliminate the comment from a reviewer saying, how were the graduate students trained to do these observations, right? Because oftentimes authors will just say, 5 graduate students completed these observations, and that's it. And that's not enough to convince a reviewer. Therefore, if you can't convince the reviewer, that's a big barrier to getting published. We want to know more about everything that the study did. And then again, if it's a study that includes observations, you've got to have a lot of detail about inter-rater reliability, or how you had decided that the observation data are quality, and you do that because you know that both raters, multiple raters, were in agreement. So then the analytic procedures. So you need to delineate the specific techniques used in relation to questions, the sequence of analytic procedures, and the statistical programs and software versions employed. You've got to, the amount of detail cannot be overemphasized. So not only do you need to note that regression procedures were employed to answer a specific research question, but you also should report what type of regression techniques were used and why those procedures were used, or why they're the most appropriate. This is a little, there's a little wiggle room in that. If it's a really common procedure and you're comparing two means, you don't have to go into detail about why you did an independent means t-test, right? But if you just say I did a t-test, a reviewer is going to want to verify that you actually did an independent means t-test. So don't just say t-test. But if you're doing especially a more advanced procedure or something newer, especially to the subdiscipline to which you're submitting your research to, so If you're school health, but you're publishing outside the health field, some disciplines may not be familiar with certain methodology, so you would want to do a little bit of education in that section. You also need to acknowledge the assumptions that go along with quantitative procedures, and not just acknowledge that they exist, but report how you evaluated them for to see if they were tenable. If the assumptions are violated, you need to clearly state that. Don't hide it, and then you also need to discuss any accommodations that you did in your analytic process to account for those violations. And then information on missing data. So ideally, you look to see if missing data is systematic or not, and so you report those results, and then how you treated those missing data. List of isolation, multiple imputation, those are pretty much only your two options. Pair isolation as well would be an acceptable option. And if you're doing a lot of comparisons, report if you use adjusted alpha level. For QUAL studies, under this section, this is what's really important to include some things about your transcription process. How thorough was the transcription, and what instructions were given to the transcribers? Was it double coded? Was it purely transcribed by people not included in this, not involved in the study? Was it independently coded by two people? All of the information about transcription. And then how was your analysis constructed? Was it based on personal intuitive interpretation, or were there some formal procedures applied? Verification, again, which measures were taken to ensure validity of the findings, so member checking, triangulation. And then when you were analyzing your data, were categories identified from theory or preconceptions, or were all categories developed from the data? So the next is you want well-organized results. I cannot stress the importance of whether it is, when I say research questions, that's more quant, but there's still a purpose to your QUAL study. Present your findings by the paragraph that you included at the end of your introduction. So if you have multiple research questions, or if you have multiple purpose statements, but organizing your results in relation to the whole reason you did the study, really it makes it much more efficient for the reader to connect what you did to what you found. And that is just something that I'm amazed at how often people do not do that, and that is key. Also, remember in your results section, you don't interpret or discuss. You literally just, you state your findings. For qualitative studies, how you do that is not as formulaic, but for quantitative studies, it's literally like, it's a template. You report, and it's very dry. And I know with students, they want to put a lot of, personal writing into this. I'm like, no, methods, result sections are pretty dry. It's just straightforward. This is what you did. This is what you found. You can interpret it in your discussion section. And also strategically use tables and figures to present your findings. But when you do that, remember that those tables and figures need to be able to stand alone. So there are some readers who actually won't read the narrative results, but they'll only go to the tables. And so they've got to know anything unique about how a variable was measured or what a variable name means. That those all need to be included in as footnotes to the table. When reporting findings from inferential procedures, use caution in the language that you use. For example, when results are not statistically significant, please, 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 please never accept or even imply that you want to accept the null hypothesis. Also, so a lack of statistical significance does not mean that the null hypothesis is true. We have to remember that. It means that there's not enough evidence to suggest that it is not true. Okay, that is huge, huge, huge. So don't do those things. For qualitative results, don't be long and drawn out. And as I was reviewing some literature on best practices for qualitative results, and they're like, don't be boring. Don't simply report lengthy quotes, because you're gonna lose the reader. Okay. And it also shows a lack of depth in the quality of the research. So the discussion section is where you're going to actually spend more time interpreting the findings. And so this is where you're able to provide your personal thoughts and insights that better explain what you found in relation to the literature. And so we like to think about this as you can talk about expected findings, unexpected findings, and unintended findings. So expected findings, again, are those findings that support your hypothesis or your research question, and often concur with previous research findings. So that's where you can talk about, tie your findings back to the literature. So that's that logical link. But one thing often researchers don't think about is those unexpected findings. And what do you do when you get findings that differ from what you hypothesized? Well, then you can speculate on, that's your time to speculate on where you think those findings came from, or why you think that your results did not support your hypotheses. So really separating, focusing first on, this is what we found and it supports this. Oh, but we also found this. And then that unintended findings are sometimes you're going to come across a relationship. And again, this is very quant, but it could be qual too. You're going to come across some relationships between variables that were not the focus of your study and no one had really looked at it, but you see them. So maybe a variable you included as a control variable, but it actually ended up having this interesting relationship with your outcome. So that would be more of an unintended finding. Yep.
Bethany, I'm sorry to interrupt. We do have a question, if you wouldn't mind taking it at this time. It's from Fatma, and they would like to ask, do you have to give all table outputs as a result or in your results section?
All table output. No, don't do that. You want to highlight the specific parts of the output in a table, but you want your results to be a summary of your tables, because if you wrote everything that was presented in your table as narrative in the results, they would be 100% redundant, and we don't want redundancy. So you want to focus on the key pieces of the table that relate to your research questions. Does that answer the question?
I think we saw, yes, thank you.
Okay, you're welcome. Okay, I'm just trying to watch time. So, so this section, I was watching time too, so don't want to stay longer than I'm supposed to, but this notion of expected, unexpected, and unintended findings, I encourage you to read the paper, because that has a lot of information in it. And this is, the discussion section, I would say, is probably one of the hardest sections for people to write. I know students, it's one of the hardest sections. And so it really is, and you'll develop your own style, but I think, and so in the paper I suggest, we don't have a perfect way to have you focus on this issue of insights, but we offer these three approaches of expected, unexpected, and unintended. So then the last section is those limitations, implications, and conclusions. And so first, write them in separate subsections, please, because it's much clearer that you've addressed all of them. The second is don't ignore limitations. So often authors want to just gloss over any limitations. I don't know if it's a fear that they think that they won't get published, but actually every single study has a limitation. There's no study that does not have a limitation. If someone can find me a study that doesn't have a limitation, please email it to me, because I've never found one and I've never conducted one. So talking about your limitations isn't going to prevent you from being published, but not talking about your limitations will prevent you from getting published, because it's bizarre. Does the researcher not know their limitations? Do they think that their study is perfect? So really, really, really addressing your limitations is key. And then your implications. Implications are, so what does this mean? And where should the literature or the field go from there? Okay, so that's where you present your next logical lines of inquiry based off of your findings in conjunction with other people's findings. And then your conclusions, that's just a nice summary subsection where I like to say for conclusions is where we communicate the practical significance of our findings and our recommendations. So prior to that, it was all the statistical, and again, that's more quant. That is how I lean, although I am mixed. But that conclusion is really that last paragraph that really shows just like you got the reader excited in the intro, you kind of want to get them excited at the end as well. So, any questions again before I go to the last few slides?
Bethany, there are no questions at this time.
Thank you. So again, I should have disclosed in the beginning that I am more quant than I am QUAL, but I was trained mixed methods. So I wanted to just, again, remind people of first the common QUAL methodologies and then the statistical procedures. So these are the, 5 most common qualitative inquiry methods. So you have your ethnography, your narrative, your phenomenological, grounded theory, and case study. And then it reminds each of you when to use which one, the sample size, typical sample size, if it's relevant, and then your data collection. So remember earlier on, I said for qualitative research, you've got to talk about why you use a specific data collection technique versus others. So this is a perfect example of where you can see, well, if you're doing a case study, why did you do interviews and not observations? Or why did you do focus groups and not interviews? So that's, so this is just a nice little summary to remind each of you of what method is appropriate. Because if you're wanting to, develop a theory, but you say, oops, whoa, sorry. If you're wanting to develop a theory, but you don't do grounded theory and you do an ethnography. So that's that mismatch between purpose and method. So I need to stop share for a second so I can share the this other table. And this table literally comes straight from the paper that I've mentioned. But so this is a nice summary table for your quantitative procedures. So just reminding you of the common tests, the assumptions that would need to be acknowledged in your methods, the correct effect size, and I didn't even get to all that, but you do need to do your effect sizes, and any additional considerations. What I do want to bring to your attention is, and again, the slides will be posted. So you have your independent t-test, your dependent t-test, your chi-square, your correlation. Those are all pretty simple. But here, one-way ANOVA and factorial ANOVA. And in the paper, I do have repeated measures ANOVA, but since then, I would like to make this point to remind you that repeated measures ANOVA is really no longer a preferred way for looking at longitudinal data or change over time, growth curves or growth curve modeling, because there's so many restrictions on doing repeated measures ANOVA with validity that it's really not the preferred method anymore. And so then we have ordinary least squares regression and logistic regression. The other thing from this table that I've pulled out that is in the table in the paper is hierarchical regression. But even in the paper, we specifically state that if you're going to use hierarchical regression, you really need to have a strong justification, theoretical justification for why you decided the ordering of the groups of the variables to be entered into the model. So again, this will get posted. I'm just being cognizant of time. Oh, why did it go back? All right, so we talked about small samples, and that's how sometimes it's a concern. So if you have small samples, I want everyone to remember that there are things called non-parametric statistics, and it's okay to use those. And there's a slide that reminds us of what those are. Also, it's okay if you have a small sample to focus on your effect sizes and not statistical significance. And last but not least, you've got to acknowledge that it is a small sample as a limitation. How small is too small is always going to depend on your research question, but this is why you should always do an a priori power analysis. But the general guideline for simple procedures such as your t-test is your sample size is greater than or equal to 30. And for more complex models like multiple linear regression, the guideline is that you need at least 10 people for every predictor in the model. But again, do your power analysis. So this is just a reminder of what the non-parametric statistics are. So again, if you were thinking you're comparing two group means, you have a small sample, don't do an independent means t-test, do a Mann-Whitney test. And here I did include the repeated measures ANOVA because if your sample's too small to do growth curve modeling or even regular repeated measures ANOVA, this would be an okay time to still not use growth curve modeling and do the Friedman test. So just a refresher on that. With school health, we often will have clustered data as you're measuring people in schools, the American, the School Health Association. And when you have cluster data, you've got to account for that. And so many people don't. So there's lots of ways to account for it. Depending on your study design, actually there's 3 options, not 2, my apologies. You can include the unit of clustering as a covariate. So if you're collecting data from kids in the same classroom, but you don't have enough classrooms to do multi-level modeling. Or the second bullet, if you got those classrooms by convenience and they were not a representative sample of all classrooms in your district or in your school, then you could use classroom as a covariate in the analysis. Or you could use robust standard errors, and those are what we often call survey procedures. Deciding where to submit your manuscript. I don't know if anyone else, maybe everyone here has heard of Jane before, but I can tell you it was only about 3 years ago when I learned about Jane. And Jane is this wonderful website. We speak of her by name. But if you are not familiar, you enter your title or your abstract, and Jane will search journals based off of documents in PubMed and produce a list of suggested journals for you to submit to. So it's really, because we know the journals we tend to read, but there may be a really great journal that is a great fit for your study, and you just haven't read anything from that journal yet. So, and also, if you want to make sure you focus on all relevant literature, you can search Jane by keywords to look at other research that is relevant to the study you're doing. So these are some resources. So that first one is a paper, and that where a lot of this presentation came from. Then when I was preparing the presentation, I found this really great guide on statistics and quant research. Here's a good paper on a review of qualitative methods. And then I didn't get to focus on it, but if you're doing research using like national data sets like the ECLSK or AdHealth or anything, any of the national IES data sets, you've got to report using that you analyze those data correctly. And this is a review paper I did many years ago that talks about those importances of using your design effects in sample weights. And Mary Beth, that is all I have. And then this is my email address. If anyone ever wants to email me with questions, I'm always happy to help. I will stop my share now.
Thank you so much, Bethany. I'm working on sharing my screen now. So at this time, if anyone has any questions, we'd be more than happy to open up, or please type them in your chat box so that we can have them available for Bethany to answer. And I'm just having a little bit of difficulty myself with my own screen.
Oh, I see. Oh,
there we go.
Making comments. Yes, Larry, you're correct. Don't make the statistical analysis more sophisticated. That's what you said it more eloquently. I had a lot to cover. Any other questions? I hope this was helpful. It's my first webinar. I'm an associate professor and I've never done one before.
And I would like to remind everyone, this is Caitlin, that the slides, the recording, and other resources will be emailed to you probably tomorrow at some point.
Okay, so I'll get you those 2 articles.
Perfect, thanks.
Thank you, Donna.
And I do see a question.
I'm actually monitoring it now.
Oh,
I see
perfect.
it. So,
you're on it.
Yeah, because if I'm not presenting, so it takes forever to hear back. For instance, it can take a year. So someone asked about the time it takes to hear back about your submission and if it will be distributed to reviewers. Yes, I would. Yes. Depending on where you are and the importance of the timeliness of getting the research out, realistically, the only thing I can say to that is talk to colleagues and figure out where, which journals are known for being really long and try to submit to ones that don't have that, especially whether you're an academic and you're in your pre-tenure, or whether it's something really important and you want it out faster. I always try to balance the best outlet with the quality of the review process. I hope that answers your question. Also, you can, if it's a slow process, you can always withdraw it. If you think that this journal is going to be great and it turns out they're not, you can always withdraw it and submit it somewhere else. You're welcome.
Any other questions at this time?
Great. Well, I really appreciated everybody. And publication fee. I would, there is in Jane, it only, be aware of predatorial journals is my first. That's how to fund it. If you don't have any funding, ask for an exception. Every journal is allowed to give exceptions. So that's the first. The second is really make sure that it's a journal that's well respected and it's not predatorial. And within Jane, that system I mentioned, it only searches open access or pay to publish journals that have been proven to be legit journals. And so those are the 2 things. I know that we've had some journal papers published over the years that we've asked for a waiver and they've knocked it down to maybe $100 of why it's a good fit for that journal and why you don't have the money. All right.
So if there are any other questions, again, Caitlin said that she would be sending out materials related to this webinar within the next few days, and Bethany has included her email there, so feel free to reach out to her. And so for this webinar, there is eligibility for continuing education credits, and members do receive free education credits, and CEs can be obtained after completing this webinar evaluation. So please, please feel free to complete the evaluation even if you're not looking for continuing education credits, but we do appreciate all feedback. But if you want those CEs, please be sure to do that also.
I wanted to add to the discussion before we stop.
Oh, sure.
I was just able to get the microphone unmuted. It was muted. It was held on mute. At any rate, the importance of testing for homogeneity of variance before using parametric statistics. I'll tell you, as an editor of a journal or associate editor of a journal, as soon as I see that, it's automatic reject. Statistical processes are incorrect. And, you know, Bethany mentioned the non-parametric statistics. So I would suggest to anybody who's just getting started in this game, make sure that you know both parametric and non-parametric statistics. And if you don't have homogeneity of variance, the easy one, SPSS has that in there. You can use the Levine's test and just do that with your data. Can't do it with qualitative data, obviously.
No.
But check your quantitative data for homogeneity of variance, and the Levine's test is right in SPSS for those of you. I don't know what it is in SAS. I'm not that familiar with SAS. Maybe Bethany is. I'm not.
There's a Levine's test in SAS too.
There is. Okay. So, you know, that's a good thing to use, and you know, the Mann-Whitney test is excellent, and so forth. So just be aware of that. Just at least mention that you checked it, say what test you did. You didn't have to say, and you say the assumptions were met, so parametric statistics could be used, and you're golden.
Exactly.
Thanks, Bethany.
You're welcome. Thanks, Larry. I think this actually got developed under your umbrella, so we finally did it.
Hey, what can I say? Yeah, you got to hold it and to unmute. Everybody have a good summer.
And with that, one of the summer or almost summer webinars is going to be around blending nutrition and education on June 20th from 3 to 4. So be on the lookout if that's of interest of you to register for that. As a reminder, again, save the date for the ASHA annual conference being held in Cincinnati this year. And thank you so much for attending.
Thank you all.